All right, up next, Lord of the Rings, The War of the Rohirrim, the upcoming animated feature film, has been a long-standing and recurring inhabitant of our news docket and conversations, but we were finally treated to our first significant look via the official trailer released by Warner Brothers last week. In addition to having the animation showcased, we got our first inklings of the story and characters, with a botched marriage proposal serving as the backdrop for the conflict. Anime is new territory for the world of Middle-earth, so the trailer has been met with mixed reactions. How are we feeling about our first look at the War of the Rohirrim?
Feeling generally pretty good. I think as long as multiverse news has been a thing, we have been discussing this project in some form or another for the entirety of our existence here. So it's one that I've been incredibly excited for, and I remain incredibly excited for. Now, as we described in the rundown there, anime is new for Middle-earth, but I've said this before, animation is not new for Middle-earth, so this is a little bit of a return to form in terms of thinking about those 70s Rankin Bass films, and where, you know, a lot of people had their first exposure to The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. Now, having said all of that, I will fully admit, while I enjoyed this trailer, there is a little bit of a disconnect. You know, having grown up on those Peter Jackson films and being so used to that world building and aesthetic, I actually think it might have been a little bit of a mistake to show so much of the live action throwbacks there, because I think it just contributed to that disconnect that I eventually felt when I started to see the animation, which is stunning, which is beautiful, which looks great. But it did take me like the better part of a good minute before I started to recognize, oh, those are Oliphants, those are different settings, those are different, you know, factions that I've seen in the world of Middle-earth. So, you know, jury's still out about how this thing is going to be received in terms of how it might perform at the box office. It is coming out in late December, so I can't help but think back to the animated feature that won the Oscar last year, and that was The Boy and the Heron. And I have to imagine this is going to perform pretty similarly to that. You've got the built-in audience of diehards that are going to watch anything Lord of the Rings, and then you've got, you know, anime has become more and more successful in the United States in theatrical releases. We see it every year. There's at least a couple anime films that we're talking about doing surprisingly well. So I don't think this is going to like knock the doors down or be the future of the Lord of the Rings by any stretch of the imagination, but I do think it's going to be a solid entry, and it's going to have some good conversations going around it. And last thing I'll say here is, I guess as long as we've been discussing this, we've known that the director is going to be this gentleman named Kinji Kamiyama, but I didn't know until this trailer came out that he was the person that directed my favorite episode of Star Wars Visions across both seasons, The Ninth Jedi. So knowing that and how that episode, it was kind of the same thing. There was that little bit of a disconnect. It was like, oh, this feels like, you know, Studio Ghibli in Star Wars. But once you get past like that 5-minute mark and the disconnect dissipates, it's so good. Like I love that episode so much. I still want to see live action interpretations of those characters. So, you know, hopefully this can do the same thing for Lord of the Rings. And once people they're, you know, in the theater and they sit through 10-15 minutes and they get accustomed to it, this might be one of the finest entries in the lore of Middle-earth that we've ever had. That's my hope anyway.
Yeah, I'm really fascinated by how the box office will turn out for this movie, because it's just such an unknown. Like you said, it's you've got Lord of the Rings fans, and I don't know how many of those who are fans of the trilogy will necessarily want to specifically go to the theater for an animated Lord of the Rings movie. Like, will they carry that over, or will it be an example of something that they're interested in, but they're sort of thinking about, I'll wait till this comes to streaming, I'll wait till this comes to Max or whatever, and watch it at home. So I think it is a test a little bit, not of Lord of the Rings. I think it's a test a little bit more of anime and animation, but anime more specifically in the theater experience, and seeing how that translates stateside, and taking a big property like Lord of the Rings and putting it into an anime form is just, there's a lot of questions that need to be answered there. How many of your anime, like hardcore anime fans, are going to go to the theater and see it and not wait for streaming, or not wait for it to be on their screens at home, and then same for Lord of the Rings fans. And again, I think it's sort of an unknown. I mean, I think the trailer looks beautiful. I think the lore seems really cool. The story seems really interesting. Like, I think all of that checks out. It's just, and that's coming from somebody who doesn't really even watch anime that much. Like, I was still very intrigued by the trailer, but still, it's also entering a very crowded space. It's entering December, which you're going to have Mufasa, you're going to have Craven, you're going to have
Gladiator 2.
Well, yeah, Gladiator 2. Yeah, but still November and kind of into that December. You're going to have Sonic 3. Like, you're going to have a lot of movies crowding that space, and it's like, which one is going to get squeezed out at the end of the day? So, again, it's kind of a wait and see for me in terms of box office. I'm definitely intrigued by it. It's something that I think I want to go see in the theater, just out of curiosity. But I'm just really intrigued on what kind of haul this thing is going to have at the box office, and if we're going to consider it a success or not, depending on that.
Right.
All the geeky franchises and, as we say, our favorite fictional universes have tried this now. Like, they're all trying to get like into the animation game in this modern time of like it being they want to flood the zone with content, but they're also trying to back off on budgets because of the streaming wars have kind of like it's been a war of attrition, and there's not a lot of like money being infused into these companies anymore. They're kind of like It's not a great setup. I heard this analysis a few weeks ago of like what Netflix did to streaming, and it was scary because basically they were like, TV used to be a thing where you had ads and you had a bunch of terrible TV shows that were just full of like kind of like non-scripted like game shows and like reality TV, and then Netflix came out with all this interesting content that was like really high dollar, and then everyone else followed suit, and it was like a trap. And then Netflix is now the place where it's like reality shows and game shows, and we all watch it, like a ton of it, and like everyone else is trying to do the prestige TV thing. Anyway, that's neither here nor there. I just thought that was really interesting analysis of that whole like it's like they juked them. They were like, whoops. But I think it's a terrible trailer because they showed so much. They showed some of the best shots from Lord of the Rings up top. Like, remember how cool this is? Mm-hmm. Here's a cartoon. Like, I know that'll be, people love animation, and there's nothing wrong with that. There's great animation, but like, they're trying really hard to just draw that line, draw that connection, make all those Lord of the Rings fans from 30 years ago or whatever it was, 20 years ago, I guess, like come back. Yeah, it's pretty close. It's getting close. But they want all those people to come back and buy into this and give it that, make it a real Lord of the Rings property and not just an animated afterthought, I guess. Sure. And I just don't know that was the way to do it. You know what I mean? Yeah. It felt like, I think it might have worked better if they did a character that we know and followed their story in animation or something like that. Something different. This is being characters that are removed by, what is it, centuries or something like that.
Yeah, I think it's like almost a couple hundred years or something before the events. Yeah, and
being animated, I just think it's really hard to draw that connection for people. But I'm hopeful based on your analysis of his work on the Star Wars series. Hopefully, this will be awesome.
I thought showing the movie footage was jarring because I knew what I was supposed to be watching, and that being the first thing was, right. I was like, wait, this isn't for me. That's my take on this film. I think that because the world of Tolkien right now is, we've got the Peter Jackson films, we've got Rings of Power, which is like separate but equal kind of a thing, and then I think it makes sense for them to get into animation for sure, but I think it's becoming like DC and their Elseworlds, where it's like, but this doesn't all have to connect. It's okay if it doesn't, especially when you have all these different studios who are making these things. And so I'm sure it will do well eventually. I don't know in the US if it'll hit really hard, but I could see it definitely growing, like when it gets to streaming and stuff like that.
On that note, too, remember in 2026 we have that Hunt for Gollum movie coming out as well, and that's supposedly connected to the trilogy.
Starting to film too.
So you've got that happening. That's live action. Andy Serkis is involved in that. You know, it's so yeah, that's a good point. Like we've got a lot of irons in the fire with Lord of the Rings a little bit, and it's like at what point are we maybe overextending the property a little bit?
One thing you brought up, Matt, is like you said you would have preferred like we follow a character that's recognizable, but and again, I like this trailer, but I do think in terms of like this disconnect I'm talking about, I think they should have showcased maybe more orcs, more dwarves, more elves, just help us feel like this really is like Lord of the Rings, because it's a lot of human characters. And like there was one guy who was like, is he a dwarf? I can't really tell. And then you see the Oliphants, but still it's like, I know those are Oliphants, but do they really look like Oliphants? And they did do the thing where they're implementing some 3D animation with the 2D animation. There were a couple of moments that didn't really jive with me, but there's still time to get that stuff sorted out, because when they do it effectively, I love that kind of stuff. But
yeah. Well, first time I ever watched Lord of the Rings, I kept finding myself completely unsurprised, and what I realized was that like a lot of the things that I had watched my entire life were based on Lord of the Rings, you know what I mean? The stories were kind of, at this point in my life, I'd seen so many stories based on this story. This story felt trite, even though when it was written, obviously it was inspired. And I think that is a problem for the Lord of the Rings series in general. Whenever you're leaving those main characters, what is the thing you get from Lord of the Rings you don't get anywhere else? And it's like, I guess the Ring of Power and the characters, and like Sauron or whatever. Right, Sauron. Sauron. And like it's just kind of like this. So many things since then have taken orcs and elves and hobbit-like characters, dwarves, like and ran with them. That it's hard. I watched this and I was like, this could be anything. This does not have. They showed a ring at one point and I was like, oh, it's a ring. That means it's Lord of the Rings. Like everything else was just like two human tribes, and they didn't even touch on the kind of race, the fantasy races we know from Lord of the Rings, like you said. Like that's a really good point. Yeah.
Well, the main story's over too, right? I mean, we've seen the trilogy. There's not really a lot to build out. Like you're not going to bring Sauron back for round 2. You know, there's not going to be like The Empire Strikes Back or whatever. Like, so you kind of have to build around a story that's been completed. And it's like, if you're not going to remake the trilogy, which it's not time for that yet, then like you kind of have to find pockets, or you have to go way back. You got to do the prequels, you know, you got to do character studies. Like if you're going to build it out, you can't really build it around the flagship, because the flagship, it's sailed, it's done. And so it's kind of, it's in this place, and the author, he's not here to contribute more to that story. You know, it's not like Game of Thrones or something where the author still here can contribute to it or whatever. So it is a little bit of a unique position.
Yeah, for sure.
I have a Game of Thrones nugget, I have to say, because it was really funny last week. Puberty was like, George R.R. Martin was asked, what would you change about your books if you could? And he was like, I would finish them. And the top comment was like, that's only on you, my guy. Like, it was so funny. I sent it to so many people. It made me laugh so hard. Like, what are you saying?
Yeah, you're not getting that book. I'm telling you, you're not getting it.
Oh my gosh, it was so
Stop
funny.
waiting on it.
Anyway, sorry. I just had to throw that out there.
That's pretty great.